Hello, my name is Alice Aronow. I was a member of Voice of Women, and I mostly was engaged in doing graphics and artwork for them. I was born in Brooklyn in 1921, and I lived in that area for a long time, and I went to Cooper Union Art School in New York because it was free and because it was a marvelous school. I was very lucky. And married just before graduation, and my husband went into the Army. That was World War II. And when that was over, we came from Chicago to this area where he found a job in the radio industry, which was what Massachusetts was kind of full of at that time. I think I've always been interested, as long as I can remember, in social and political events. I feel as if these things impinge on our lives whether we like it or not. I would love nothing better than to have a life of quiet contemplation and just doing my artwork and reading and singing. But unfortunately, I think that the world demands of us that we be conscious of what's going on around us, and I feel a real obligation to do that. I feel it's a responsibility to your children and to succeeding generations, to all the kids. When I came to Massachusetts, the war was just over, and it was a really interesting time because during the war, supplies of everything were very short, and it was hard for us to find a place to live. Nobody had been building houses, but people had been having children. Well, during that period, and we ended up in Watertown, Massachusetts, and after a while, about 15 years later, we moved to Newton because we liked the idea of the way the Newton schools were run. I have a large family of 6 children, and they're all married, and I have 11 grandchildren who are doing all kinds of various things. And I would like to speak to you a little bit about the things that I did for Voice of Women. Is that okay? All right. Yeah. I believe that my background is typical of many, many others of first and second generation Jews from Poland and Russia and that area. My father came here when he was 17 to escape being drafted into the Tsar's army. I think he was born in 1888, but we really don't have any records. And he had a love-hate relationship with Russia. And sometimes he felt as if he was a socialist, and other times, most of the time, he wanted nothing more. His dream was to be a successful entrepreneur and business person. My mother was an American girl who had gone to wasn't college then, it was Hunter Normal School, to be a school teacher. And that was sort of a complete break in a way with the past. Her older sisters had all married and started homemaking pretty soon, but she has become a working woman with one older sister who rounded up a whole bunch of girls on the east side where they lived and said, we're all going to go to normal school, to Hunter Normal School, we're all going to become teachers, and that's what they did.
What year would that have been,
That
do you
would
think?
have been 1996. Let me think for a minute. I have to think about this. My mother was born, I think, in 1886. She was Hunter Normal, I believe, at that time was the last 2 years, equivalent, the last 2 years of high school that we have now. So she would have been about 18, 19 when she became a teacher.
So it was around the turn of the century.
Around 1910 or something like that. Yeah.
And your maiden name was what?
My maiden name was Perlman, and there again, this is one of those emigre stories, stories where my father said his name was Yassel Israel Perlbach, And here he was known as Joe Perlman, because that was the name that was given to him more or less at Ellis Island.
And he became a businessman?
He became a small businessman. He was really tossed on the stormy seas of entrepreneurship, sort of, because what really broke everything was the Depression. And the coming of the Depression and the loss of our money in the Bank of America, which happened to a lot of other young families, and having no backup in the form of Social Security or unemployment insurance. None of those things existed then. Made your life was your fortunes were very, very fragile. It was a very, very hard time for the next 10 years, and that was my growing up period. And I believe that people in my generation who had those experiences were really marked for life by that. And we felt a great concern that it should not happen again for us or for other people. The terrible uncertainty, the anxiety that went with never having enough money, never knowing if you were going to have the rent money, and really having to be very, very careful and thoughtful about how you used a food budget and so on. So I think probably that was a very strong influence in making my succeeding interest in what was happening worldwide, nationwide, because I knew that ultimately it affected you as an individual.
You know,
I guess, let's see, when I moved to Newton around 1975, is that right?
60. You said.
1960, yeah, I moved to
61.
Newton, that's right, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Let's see. I think we were looking for a better school system than we thought we had in Watertown. So we moved to Newton in around 1960. And I became involved in peace and civil rights activities pretty much as an artist. I did flyers and posters for people that were doing some of the legwork. And I guess that was my involvement when we started the Peace Boutique, which the Voice of Women inaugurated as a place where peace and civil rights people could meet, discuss things, and it would also act as a fundraising place for the movements they were interested in. I have some of the artwork that I did around that time. This is a piece that I did on my Silkscreen that was it was adapted from the artwork of Eleanor Rubin when she was seriously becoming involved in her artwork, and she had made a woodcut, and I asked her if I could take the idea of that woodcut and change it around a little so that it would be appropriate for the screen. And I think we used this as a fundraiser in a very, very modest way. I think we probably sold these for maybe $10 each or something like that. Some people still have them. I think it was printed on brown wrapping paper. I think I like that color with these things. Okay. This is printed by Silkscreen in my attic when I lived in Franklin Street. When I lived on Franklin Street in Newton Corner. And I think we probably turned out about between 50 and 100 of these. It was just one color, so that was simple. The beauty of Silkscreen is that with comparatively little equipment, and it can be pretty much all homemade, you can repro things almost unlimited in size if you're willing to be ingenious about it, and as many copies as you want, and as many colors as you want, just depending on how complicated you want to be. And this was a very valuable tool for people in the peace movement who wanted to publicize various events in a colorful way, because it could be done in your attic or in your studio in the days before computer, before you could turn out this stuff, before it was so easy to have a Photoshop enlarge, for example, what you had done. And so this was a poster that I made for a fundraiser that was an attempt to raise money for the Newton Community Peace Center, which had its headquarters at the Elliott Church down at Newton Corner. This is the original, and this is called a Photoscreen. This part was Photoscreen from a drawing, and I believe that all the printing was done by me right on this piece of plastic, this acetate film, which was then laid on another type of film, put under an electric light for a certain amount of time, and then that film was placed against a silk screen that was stretched on a frame. And using warm water to remove a plastic layer from that, what you had was a residue of film with all this work on it left on the screen. Then you used something called a squeegee, a wooden board with a rubber blade in it, and you pulled ink across the screen, and the ink was forced through all the open areas, but it couldn't affect the closed areas. So this is the way much of the publicity work was done by me at that time, just locally here for these purposes. This is another adaptation of Eleanor Rubin's figure that she had done as a small woodcut, and which, as I said, I had gotten permission to adapt for my purposes. And then I did all of this stuff by hand and silkscreened between 50 and 100 copies of this. And I don't really remember anymore where we put them up, but we must have displayed them all over. And then we did them on another sheet, which Rona just took away, and we sold those. This is during the Vietnam War, when we wanted our country to pull. This was used around the Boston area, especially around anything that the Newton people participated in. The original artwork was done by somebody named Eric, who was going to college either at Amherst or at UMass simultaneously with one of my two kids who were out there at that time going to school. And what he's got here is an airplane, which probably represents our bombers. Oh no, it's a helicopter, I guess. Maybe they're spraying napalm, I don't know. And this is something like fields here, but it's also part of the hat. And of course the child's face, obviously a Vietnamese child. And we just took with Eric's permission, we simply took his artwork, which I consider very, very effective, and we happen to have some wooden type, which we used to produce this piece now, old wooden type. This was nailed onto sticks and carried in parades and in protest demonstrations by a fair number of people, actually. And sometimes we used it a little differently. Here's another way of using just part of that screen. And this must have been hung around somebody's neck. Actually, what this says on the back is, it says, Bigelow Junior High, Newton Bigelow Junior High, peace, is what it says. So some kids used it for that purpose. This is a very interesting piece. It's much earlier, And this is not my work. This is the work of a well-known artist of that time, Art Wood. His signature is right here. And he did, believe he did this whole thing. It looks like his work to me, but I know that he did this figure which is very reminiscent of Pete Seeger. And he has a very, very spontaneous quality in all his artwork. And I'm going to guess that it was done as a volunteer art job for the peace movement. It was for the Massachusetts Political Action for Peace. This is Congressional District number 10, and for once we have the date on it, Saturday, September 7th, 1963. So that was 40 years ago.
And I will do.
Yes. Well, another thing about this Artwood poster that was really important to me was the fact that it talks about an open Hootenanny. Now, Hootenanny is real important to me because it was just around 1959, 1960 that my husband and I were founding members of, among several other people, of the Folk Song Society of Greater Boston. And so we were very familiar with the term Hootenanny because a lot of the leaflets, flyers that I did for the Folk Song Society referred to open hoots. And admission was usually something like 50 cents for adults, and we met at the Y in Boston on Huntington Avenue. So that whole concept was a whole other thing. I guess you'd probably call it an open mic now, actually. And this figure definitely, to me, relates to Pete Seeger, although I doubt if Pete Seeger was at this particular function.
What happened at a Hootenanny?
Excuse me?
What happened at a Hootenanny?
At a Hootenanny, people could just simply take turns coming up before the audience and singing, and it was extremely participatory, and everybody pretty soon learned the chorus if they didn't already know the chorus. And so it was a very free and very open kind of a thing with lots and lots of audience participation. It was a very pleasurable event, always. This, I believe, is an earlier one, and I don't know how that's going to show up. The lines are thinner. But for some reason, I was decorating everything with angels, sort of cherub-type angels at that time. So I threw one in here, and this was a book and bibelot sale at the Elliott Church, which was so welcoming somehow or other to groups like ours, like the peace group that we had that preceded the Voice of Women. It's called, again, the Newton Community Peace Center. Well, this, I guess, was running at the same time as Voice of Women by that time. But this Newton Community Peace Center, I believe, actually preceded it. So that was that. I have nothing else. My kids. Well, my oldest is Victor. He's in his late 50s now, and he is actively suggesting to our government that our policies towards the war in Afghanistan are not correct. And he has always maintained a very strong individualist attitude about expressing his views on the subjects of peace and civil rights and so on. And a couple of years ago, he decided that the town he lived in, Tempe, which is just outside of Phoenix, should really have a day where nobody would commit any crimes, no violence against anybody else. And so he printed up 2,000 leaflets telling about this idea of his and distributed them at busy sections in Tempe. And a number of people called him up, and he said, no, there is no organization, no parade, and no placards. You just have to sort of decide that on this certain particular day, I think it was an anniversary of maybe of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, possibly, you will not raise your voice in anger, nor will you watch anything violent at all on television. You'll certainly not carry any weapons, and you will be extremely gentle with your children and with your neighbors. And he said, we're just going to make up our minds that we will be nonviolent all day long and see how it feels. And people heard about this, wrote to the newspaper, the local newspaper, about it, and somebody brought it to the city council, and the mayor declared that day to be a day of nonviolence in Tempe, Arizona. That's what happened. So that's the kind of thing Victor does. My son Fred has been involved in supporting very actively and being on the board of a retirement home for people who have been in the film industry. He lives in Los Angeles. People who have been in the film industry and are now not wealthy but need a place to spend their final years. And that's been one of his major activities for about the last 10 years, is just to keep this retirement home going for these people. It's called Sunset Hall. I think it's kind of known in some circles by now. And my other boys have likewise engaged in similar kinds of activities. And my girls too, one of them was arrested. Jessie was arrested at Seabrook in the Clamshell Alliance and spent 2 weeks in the National Guard barracks, and decided at that point to switch all her courses at UMass from drama and African jazz dancing and things like that to biology and environmental studies, which is what she did. And Louise, her older sister, organized a number of years ago, organized a number of women, and they all took their babies and their strollers down to the IRS, and they all had loaves of bread in the strollers with the babies, and they explained to the IRS that they would be willing to pay their taxes only if they could do it in bread rather than in money, because they didn't want to support the manufacture of munitions. So I can only say that my kids do things in a kind of individual way.
How do you think growing up in your house affected that?
Well, I don't think it was all for the good. I think sometimes they felt pushed by our ideas, because in some cases there was they had problems at school because they were outspoken in ideas that they had picked up at home. And so it's possible that I might not do things exactly the way I did them at that time. And at the same time, the fact is that our family was a little bit different from most of our neighbors. And I guess it was necessary for my kids to understand that from the beginning, although it made some difficulties for them in school at Bigelow Junior High.
And
Gets here was his final word, and then Fred shows up.
so it sounds like you had a real solidarity around these issues in your family, huh?
Well, I was very frightened during that whole period because
Okay,
I was afraid Victor would
stop.
end up in jail.
Stop! You're gonna say okay.
Oh, I'm not gonna
No, you
tell
gotta
you.
say what you were frightened during this period. Okay, your children were draft resistant, or they were eligible for the draft. You can
Yes.
say, yeah, okay. Well, will you start with that, and then you can go.
I don't think it's appropriate. We're talking about the women's peace movement centered in Newton, and already, we're diverging out and everything.
Okay. Do what you want, but it shows how the influence on your kids.
Was a draft resistor.
Okay, wait a minute. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And say it was the date, today's date.
Yeah. No. I realize that.
Yeah. Well, it is.
Okay.
Is there any way you could wrap it up, Alice, in some way, in terms of your own life and involvement?
Maybe you could put the date in there. Say it's
Yeah.
October 30th.
Okay.
2001, and
Okay.
we're all still feeling the effects
Yeah.
of September 11th or something like that.
And where do you see yourself at
Today.
this point
Yeah, that experience, how's it
in,
relevant?
in terms of what was and how do you feel now?
So it's October 30th, right?
Yeah.
You want to get that accurate. Okay.
Yeah.
All
Okay.
right. Okay. I would say that I don't see how I could have done other than what I did, but I believe that for someone of my temperament, I've lived a rather stressful life. I think it would be kind of nice had I been able to just think about painting and drawing and music, and because those are the things that are terribly important to me, but I feel that they had to be put aside or redesigned, channeled, because I would never want again to see people in the situation that I and my parents were in, and my brother, when we were kids. I don't want that kind of feeling to come again for anybody. Although we certainly did not suffer as much as others did during the period of the Depression in this country. In terms of where we are now, I can only hope for some kind of a world where everybody has a kind of a baseline of a reasonable kind of a life. I'm very, very concerned about what's coming up next, and I'm very concerned for my children and my grandchildren and everybody in their generations. I can't take an optimistic view at this point, really.
It's October 30th,
Yeah.
2001, and we're still
And we're
feeling
still
that.
messing around the same old way, and it feels as if we do not learn. We don't seem to learn. And I'm really tired of these kind of fights. I know for some people it's really enervating, but it really isn't for me, because I don't think that's what life is supposed to be about. However, I think that's what life has to be about in order for us to really shoulder our responsibilities.
Okay.
I can think of a quotation by I don't know whom: "Eternal vigil is the price of liberty." I think we have to be very careful in distinguishing between necessary curtailment of what we regard as our civil rights in a democratic society, and the possibility of those in authority going overboard in curtailing the right of expression of people who don't see it the same way as the powers that be in pursuing this war. I think we have to learn a different way to do things. And this is a very, very complex issue. This is not just a religious war, although it has those elements. And it's not just a war about oil, although that's an element. It seems in some respects as if there is actually a kind of breaking apart within the international Muslim community, for example. There are all kinds of other things happening here. There is great resentment against the United States because it seemed to be in so much control of everybody else's lives all around the globe. And until we recognize the anguish that in many cases we have caused other people, until we are willing to take responsibility for being part of what shaped the attitudes of those who don't like us, who hate us, we are not going to resolve this situation. And I think that's how I feel on this October 30th, 2001.
Good.